Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Hibden. I am the Strategic Communications Manager in the College of Liberal Arts, and I would welcome you to our Zoom webinar tonight. If you've not used the Zoom webinar function before, it's a lot like a regular Zoom meeting, but a little bit different. We have a Q&A feature that is in your meeting controls, and that's how you can submit questions to our panelists tonight, and we ask that you please use that feature instead of the chat. And we also have the event live closed captioned and is being recorded. If you would like to access that later, please go to the College of Liberal Arts YouTube channel, and I'll now turn it over to Dr. Laura Daniel.
Thank you, Matthew. In just a few days, on Tuesday, November 3rd, Americans will go to the polls and elect the next president of the United States. I'm Professor Laura Daniel. I'm a professor of business law in the Jones College of Business at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm on the advisory board for the American Democracy Project at MTSU, and I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Murfreesboro and Rutherford County, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for our session on the Electoral College, Origins, Operations, and Issues. And tonight, we will find out why my first statement is false. We will go to the polls on Tuesday, November 3rd, but we will not elect the president. Instead, we will elect the members of the Electoral College, and they in turn will elect the next president. To help us understand the Electoral College, its origins, operations, and issues, I am joined by three MTSU political scientists. Dr. Mark Byrnes is the university provost. Dr. John Weil is the dean of the MTSU Honors College, and Dr. Michael Federici is chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations. We are assisted tonight by Dr. Karen Peterson, dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and Mr. Matthew Hibden, strategic communications manager for the College of Liberal Arts. And as Matthew explained, he will be monitoring the Q&A feature, and we encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the discussion. While we wait for questions to come in from the audience, I have a few to get the discussion started. And Dr. Weil, my first question is for you. It is about the origins of the Electoral College. Why did the framers of the U.S. Constitution choose this form? Where did it come from, and why did they decide on an Electoral College over their other options?
Laura, I'm going to give something that's a little bit more like a presentation than a typical answer. As we get a little bit later in the program, I think we'll become a bit more informal. But I'd like to begin by saying that you asked particularly today, we like things to be simple. But when the founders gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to draft a new constitution, they weren't simply formulating a system for electing a president, they were changing an entire system. Among other changes that they brought about were changing a confederal government into a federal government, a unicameral Congress into a bicameral Congress, and a national government of one branch into a government of three branches. Professor, I hope I get to pronounce this right, Shlomo Sloman observes that the convention discussed presidential selection on 21 different days during the summer of 1787 and took more than 30 votes on the subject. He further argues that the final compromise was something of a tripod, related first to how to choose the president. That was related to the length of presidential terms and also whether the president would be eligible for election or re-election. The selection process, as we will see, was a bundle of compromises, which some might liken to a Rube Goldberg device, and some of which had probably had some unintended consequences. We should remember that when the delegates formulated the Electoral College, horseback was a common method of transportation. There was no system of instantaneous communication. There were no computers to aggregate votes over 13 states, much less the 50 that we have today. And many delegates feared that individuals would not necessarily be familiar with delegates who were running for president from other states. George Mason, who is the primary author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, said, quote, "It would be as unnatural to refer the choice of the proper character for chief magistrate to the people as it would be to try to refer a trial of colors to a blind man." He thus highlighted how the central goal of most delegates was not to create a populist democratic government, but a representative Republican government in which delegates would exercise some independent judgment on behalf of their constituents. James Wilson, a prominent delegate from Pennsylvania, did in fact favor popular election of the president, but almost all the delegates thought that this option was highly impractical. So the primary alternative today to the Electoral College is typically popular election or some variant thereof, but the most common alternative to what we today call the Electoral College was not popular election, but was election by one or both houses of Congress or some subset or combination of the two. This was ultimately rejected in the belief that it would lead to heightened legislative intrigue and possible corruption, that it would push the United States into a parliamentary system, which they didn't seem to favor, and that it would erode presidential independence by making the president overly dependent on a more permanent body like the Congress. Other proposals which might have perpetuated the weak government under the Articles of Confederation proposed possible election of the president by state governors. The allocation of votes to states ended up being by adding the total number of representatives and senators, which sometimes leads, as our two other panelists will show, to results where the popular vote is in one direction and the Electoral College vote is in the other. But the Electoral College apportionment was based on what's called the Connecticut Compromise. And most of you know this was a compromise whereby all states in the House of Representatives would be represented according to population, largely, and then each state would have 2 senators. And I should also mention the vice presidency comes indirectly out of the Electoral College, in that under the original system, which our colleagues will describe, individuals had to cast 2 votes, one of which was from someone from another state. Political scientist John Roach has described the Electoral College as offering something to everyone. It gave some power to the state legislatures, who initially supervised the selection of electors. It gave representation to large states and to small states. It left open the possibility, which was largely later realized, that the people could choose their electors directly, and it even provided for Congress to step in the process in case no one emerged with majority. The nation's government has, of course, become considerably more democratic since it was adopted in 1789. Many people find it frustrating that the winner of the Electoral College is sometimes someone other than the winner of the popular vote. And to explain how that will happen, I believe one of my colleagues are going to take that issue.
Thank you, Dr. Weil. Excuse me. Now that we have an idea of how we arrived at this system, Dr. Federici, would you tell us more about how it works? How is the Electoral College organized, and what process is actually used to determine who's president? And of course, what does our vote have to do with that?
Well, thank you, Professor Daniel, for helping to organize this event. And I think the best way for me to go through the nuts and bolts of the Electoral College system is to share some PowerPoint slides with you. So just give me 1 second to share my screen. And I will start with the total number of electoral votes. So how do we know how many electoral votes there are? There are currently 538 electoral votes, and that number equals the total number of members of Congress, that is members of the House and members of the Senate. So there's currently 435 members of the House, 100 in the Senate, that's 535. In 1961, the Constitution was amended to give the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. So that's how we get from 535 to 538. That's the total number of electoral votes. Each state then gets a number of electoral votes that is equal to its seats in Congress, both the House and the Senate. So Tennessee has 11 electoral votes because it has 9 seats in the House and 2 senators. My former state of Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes because it has 18 members in the House and 2 in the Senate. States distribute their electoral votes on what's called a winner-take-all system, with the exceptions of Maine and Nebraska. So let me explain the winner-take-all system first, and then I will go back and explain how Maine and Nebraska distribute their electoral votes. What's meant by a winner-take-all system is that the winner of the popular vote in a state gets all of that state's electoral votes. So it's all or nothing. So in Tennessee, whichever candidate gets a plurality, remember what a plurality is, that just means more than anybody else. It does not have to be a majority. So the candidate who wins a plurality of the popular vote gets all of that state's electoral votes. So 48 of the states and the District of Columbia use that winner-take-all system, which, by the way, is not required by the Constitution to distribute their electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska use the same system, and it works like this. Maine has 4 electoral votes, Nebraska has 5 electoral votes. The winner of the popular vote in the state, so the winner of a plurality of the popular vote, gets the 2 electoral votes that correspond to that state's Senate seats. And then the individual electoral votes that correspond to congressional districts are based on which candidate wins a plurality of the popular vote in that congressional district. So in Maine and Nebraska, you have the possibility of the electoral vote being split. In 2016, Donald Trump won 1 electoral vote in Maine, and Barack Obama won 1 electoral vote in Nebraska. I believe that was in 2008. So to win the Electoral College requires a simple majority of the total electoral votes. Because there are 538 electoral votes, exactly half of 538 would be 269, which is not a simple majority. A simple majority is 50% plus 1. So 269 plus 1 equals 270. That's the magic number. And if you're watching election returns on Tuesday night, that's what you're looking for as the electoral votes start to pile up on both sides, is who's getting close to 270. Now, there is the possibility, which has happened 2 times, that no candidate will receive a simple majority of the electoral vote. In that case, the election is decided by the Congress. The House of Representatives picks the president, and the Senate picks the vice president. And they each use a different process for selecting the president in the House and the vice president in the Senate. When the House decides the president, each state gets 1 vote. So California has 1 vote, Wyoming has 1 vote. It doesn't matter how many electoral votes a state has, every state gets 1 vote, and it's a majority rule, which means with 50 states, you need 26 state delegations to become president. The House is limited in voting from the top 3 vote getters in the electoral vote. So they can't pick somebody who didn't get any electoral vote, who wasn't really a presidential candidate. In the House of Representatives, every individual senator votes, and it takes a simple majority of the senators, which would be 51, in order to become vice president. That presents the possibility that the House could pick a president from one party and the Senate could pick a vice president from another party. The 2 elections in which this happened were in 1800 and in 1824. 1800, it was a tie between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. That can no longer happen as a result of the 12th Amendment, which gives members of the Electoral College 2 votes, 1 for president and 1 for vice president. Under the old system, Members of the Electoral College got 2 votes, both for president. Whoever got the most votes was president. Whoever finished second was vice president. So you could get an outcome like we had in 1796, where Adams, who was from one party, became president, and Jefferson, who was a rival from another party, became vice president. So what happens on election day? Why does it matter what voters do then? Well, the Constitution says that on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which really just means that election day can't be on November 1st on a Tuesday, the voters go to the polls, and technically they do not vote directly for president. They vote for slates of electors. So if you vote in Tennessee, there are 11 electors, and when you cast your vote, you're voting for a slate of electors who are pledged to a particular presidential candidate, Trump, Biden, or any of the other candidates running for president. So voters vote directly for the slates of electors, not directly for president. The electors are chosen by their political parties. So they're bitterly partisan people who, except in very rare circumstances, remain faithful to the popular vote. And those electors then meet 6 weeks roughly. It's the second Wednesday after the first Monday in December. They meet in their respective state capitals and they cast their ballot. That is, the slate of electors that the people chose, only that slate goes to the state capitol, and then they individually cast their votes. Each one of their electoral votes counts in the process. There is the possibility of faithless electors. That is, an elector who is pledged to one candidate ends up voting for someone else. I have some examples here that you can see. In 1988, there was one faithless elector. In 2000, there was one elector who was supposed to vote for Al Gore but didn't cast a vote. In 2004, there was one elector, Democratic elector, who voted for John Edwards instead of John Kerry, the presidential candidate. In 2016, there were 7 faithless electors. That's more in one election than we have had in 100 years. And you can see the list of individuals that those electors voted for. So in the official returns of the 2016 election, all of those individuals, including Faith Spotted Eagle, received an electoral vote. And then the final step in the process is that the first week in January, which is January 6th, unless that falls on a Sunday, in which case it's January 7th, a joint session of Congress meets. They count the electoral votes and they declare the winner and basically certify the election. Now, one important law that can come into play at that point is the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which gives Congress a process for dealing with disputed electoral votes from states. It was a result of the Hayes-Tilden election when there were disputed electoral votes from more than one state. And in that instance, the House votes on which are the correct electoral votes, the Senate votes, if they agree, that's the end of the process. If the House and the Senate split, the decision goes back to the state and the governor of that state makes the decision. And one just interesting side note is that in the 2000 election, if this law had been invoked, and we were close to it being invoked for Florida, it would have meant that the House would have voted for Bush. The Senate would have been tied 50-50 with the 50th vote for Gore Lieberman being cast by Lieberman, Senator Lieberman himself, and the decisive vote being cast by Al Gore because he breaks ties in the Senate. And Gore, I'm sure, would have voted for Gore Lieberman, which would have meant the House and the Senate were split and the election would have gone back to Florida. And the governor, who was Jeb Bush, George Bush's little brother, would have been the one to make the decision. The law was created to keep politics out of the process. In that instance, if it had been invoked, that would not have happened. And that is the Electoral College process.
Well, thank you, Dr. Federici. I have to tell you, it sounds kind of complicated to me. No wonder it has, over our history, given rise to some issues. And Dr. Byrnes, that's what we would like to hear about from you. In particular, these times when the results of the Electoral College have not been consistent with the results of the popular vote. How many times has that happened? And I believe it has happened twice in the last 20 years. Do you find that significant at all?
I do. Thank you, Laura. It's happened 5 times in our history where the candidate who received the most votes of American citizens wound up not winning the election because of the Electoral College. Now, some of the early, actually, they all have their own stories associated with the elections, and there's some really fascinating wrinkles with each of the elections. 1824, 1876, 1888, all of those 19th century elections featured this problem. And problem seems to understate it almost to me, but this phenomenon of the popular vote winner losing the Electoral College. And then, as you said, twice in the last 20 years, in 2000, George W. Bush won the electoral vote, whereas the loser of the election, Al Gore, actually won about 500,000 more popular votes. And then in 2016, of course, Donald Trump won the electoral vote while losing the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by nearly 3 million. So does this mean it's more likely to happen now, given that we've had 2 in the last 20 years? I don't know. It's hard to predict. It's more likely in close elections than it is in blowouts, obviously. How can it even happen? Michael did a very nice job of going through the convoluted steps through which the Electoral College operates, and John did a nice job of talking about some of the historical background of why we created this mechanism. Basically, because it's a winner-take-all system, it doesn't matter by how many votes you win or lose the state, the outcome doesn't change. So it's possible that if you lose a number of states in the popular vote by a narrow margin, you could still win the nationwide popular vote and yet lose the electoral vote. That is, you don't get any credit. If you win 49% of the popular vote in California and your opponent wins 51, you still lose and get no credit for those votes. So that's really how it can happen. It's just how are those popular votes distributed, and how does it fit into this winner-take-all system that we have created? So to me, that raises some fundamental questions about fairness. We have an electoral system in which we talk about one person, one vote. The Supreme Court has ruled in a variety of cases on that. And yet that doesn't really seem to be what we have now. So that's one, in my view, pretty significant problem, is that the popular vote winner can wind up losing the election. Although I got to say, I started teaching a class in the presidency in 1991. And so for 9 years in this presidency class, we would get to the point of talking about presidential elections, and students would always be really interested in the Electoral College and how it works. And the question would come up, well, how is it that we have a system in which this can happen? And I very wisely said, well, it's really going to take this to happen again in a modern election, and then people will get motivated to change the Constitution. And so that was one of the many times in which I was completely wrong, because it happened in 2000 and there was hardly a peep about changing the Constitution. There was a lot of focus on the weirdness in Florida and the butterfly ballots and all of that nonsense. Hardly any discussion about the more important to me question of, does this reflect a flaw in our system? And then again, it happened 4 years ago, and there wasn't any significant talk or certainly not any action to change the system then. So the second problem, in my view, is again tied to that winner-take-all element of the Electoral College. If you happen to live in a non-competitive state, say Tennessee, if you're a Democrat in Tennessee, well, you can go vote for the Democratic candidate, but the odds are it's not going to make any difference, because Tennessee, now who knows, I got out of the prediction business after 2016 when I was profoundly and consistently wrong, but seems likely that Trump will carry Tennessee. We haven't seen the candidates here at all except to raise money. Your vote almost doesn't count. Or if you're a Republican living in California, which is almost certainly going to go Democratic, it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't count. You'd have very little chance of impacting the election. So only if you live in a swing state does your vote have, in my view, a reasonable chance of affecting the outcome of the election. I think we need to ask ourselves, are we okay with that?
Well, some of the comments that you've made are directly related to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. So let me pose this, and any of you feel free to take it. Why do all but 2 states have a winner-take-all system for electoral votes? Wouldn't allowing for electoral votes to be split within a state be more representative of those states' citizens? And of course, I'll add to that, and that wouldn't require amending the Constitution, would it? Because that's something that every state makes on their own, a decision each state makes for themselves, isn't it?
That's correct. It's not a constitutional requirement, but it's a catch-22, and here's why. When a state uses a winner-take-all system, what it means is that the prize is greater of electoral votes in that state. So it makes it more likely, especially if you're a smaller state with fewer electoral votes, that candidates will come to your state and try and seek votes out in that state. So you dilute the reward in the state if you divide the electoral vote, at least potentially in the way that Nebraska and Maine do. That's number one. Number two, Nebraska and Maine, all the years that they've had that system, have only divided their electoral vote 1 time each. Now, if you did it in a bigger state like California, Colorado had it on the ballot a few years ago and it failed. The advantage you would have is that candidates that wouldn't normally come to your state now would come to your state because there is a prize that they can win that otherwise they wouldn't win. So in some cases, in some states, it might make sense to get rid of the winner-take-all system and go to the Maine and Nebraska system. And in other states, it might actually hurt the attention that they get from the candidates.
If you really want to be representative, do away with the Electoral College and go by what the people say. I mean, that to me, that's 100% representative of the people's will. It would be an improvement, I think, probably if every state did that, but I don't know what is to be gained. I know that there is a traditional argument about small states being protected under the Electoral College, but if you look at this year, the 8 or 10 smallest states are not competitive. Candidates are not going there. So I'm not sure what benefit those states are really getting now, or even why we really care about the state as an entity in a presidential election. Now, I think John can has a federalism argument. He and I have talked about this issue for years, and so I'll pass it to him for his comments.
Dean Weil, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There we go.
You could make a similar and probably stronger argument for saying that our whole system is unbalanced because every state has 2 votes in the Senate. So it's a much less unbalanced system than that. And it assures that the smallest state gets at least 3 votes. Now, that I'm not necessarily advocating that we keep the Electoral College, but that is what it does. It does, and many of these states are rural in nature, so they might get a little bit more attention. They're not quite swallowed up by some of the cities. And as Dr. Federici and I were talking even before this program began, some people believe in some cases, minorities hold sort of the balance of power in some of these large states, and it does give them more representation than they might otherwise have.
Yeah, no, we're not.
Go ahead, Dr.
I'm sorry, Laura. No, I know we're not advocating either way, and I'm not trying to do that either. I mean, I think it is an interesting question. to compare the Senate, which obviously is based on state regardless of size, to the Electoral College. I guess my response to that would be the Senate is operating the way that the framers intended it, more or less. I mean, 2 states or 2 senators per state, that still works. Whereas I'm not sure that the Electoral College is working the way that they intended it in terms of who they wanted to make the presidential decision. So I would say that would be something to consider.
You know, I mentioned that in the original Electoral College system, it came closer to Congress, you know, to republicanism in that it was you elected someone who exercised their judgment on your behalf, and that has long gone,
Right.
you know, long gone. If I can make one little footnote to what Dr. Federici said, because I always love the example of the faithless electors, but there was a very recent Supreme Court decision whose name I do not remember, but within the last 2 or 3 months, that affirmed that a state can simply, or a party can kick off a faithless elector. So I don't think that's as likely to be happening in the future as in these couple examples that were brought up.
Okay, now this next question, I'll just say I'm glad I get to ask it instead of try to answer it. It really, I think, goes to the foundation of everything we're talking about. The existence of the Electoral College seems contrary to a democratic form of government. Can you explain why this happens in a democracy?
I will be happy to address that question and would say that it depends what you mean by democracy, because the Electoral College system is perfectly democratic if you think of it as being federally democratic. It is not democratic if you think of it as being nationally democratic. And I think people who advocate for a system to replace the Electoral College that's based simply on the popular vote, what they want is a nationally democratic system. But there is nothing, and I choose my words carefully, there's absolutely nothing in the American constitutional system that is based on a national momentary majority. There's nothing. So the Electoral College is perfectly consistent with everything else, even the House of Representatives, because every state is guaranteed at least 1 representative, regardless of their population. The Electoral College is perfectly consistent with the federally democratic system that the Constitution creates. To change it to something that was nationally democratic would be rather radical and revolutionary in terms of changing the very fabric of our constitutional system.
Our next question is, and I think you've addressed this to some degree, but why are some states more important for presidential candidates than others? What makes a state a swing state?
Well, I'll take a whack at that one, Laura. I mean, the bigger the state, the more valuable it is. So California has 55 electoral votes. That's hugely important. So why is it the candidates are not campaigning there? It's because they know that the Democratic nominee is almost certain to win the state. So there's nothing to be gained because of the winner take all element of campaigning there. The Republican candidate might win a few more percentage points of the popular vote, but it doesn't matter. You don't get any of the electoral votes. So the swing states are simply those in which the race is close enough that activity by the candidates and the campaigns might affect the outcome. And that's why they get all the attention. There's no point in going to California except to raise money. You're not going to campaign there, but you are going to campaign in Florida and Pennsylvania. What the swing states are vary by election, but the states where the polls indicate that the race is close, that's where you might affect the outcome on the Electoral College.
Do you think that after this election, there will be a serious discussion about eliminating the Electoral College? And if so, what steps would need to be taken as citizens if we wanted the Electoral College abolished or reformed?
Maybe I'll take that. I think what Mark said, perfectly answers that. I was among those who also thought, it had been so long since we had had a discrepancy between the two that once it happened, maybe after 2000, we would have calls for change. you know, the constitutional amending process, which is one of my favorite topics, is extremely difficult. 3/4 of both houses, which is it? Okay, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, 3/4 of the states. That is a tremendous obstacle, and you'd almost have to have, you know, you'd have to have such a discrepancy that people would say, you know, how in the world could you lose by 10 million votes less and still, you know, still win the election? And so my guess is if we get change, it's more likely to be the kind of incremental change that we talked about, you know, certain states deciding, well, if we, you know, in my own judgment, there's a certain advantage in being in a state where neither candidate bothers you during the election. But if you want them there, that might be a way of getting them there.
And I agree with John. I don't see any signs that there's going to be a serious discussion. If people wanted it, the thing to do would be to, you know, make your opinion known and contact your members of Congress. But it doesn't seem likely to me.
I will add very quickly that the only thing I think that would create something like a movement to replace the Electoral College would be if we got a repeat of what just happened in 2016 and one candidate lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. I mean, that would be 3 times in 20 years that happened, and I think that would be upsetting to many people. So that might spark some sort of movement, but at the same time, I agree with my colleagues. Amending the Constitution is extremely difficult. I think what you'd be more apt to see, perhaps, is a change in the winner-take-all system, which, as we've said, does not require a constitutional amendment, and that's a lot easier to do.
So you think it's more likely that there would be change at the state level?
Yes.
Okay. This is a great question. Do any other countries have now, or have they had in the past, a system such as ours?
Well, I don't think so, John or Michael.
Well, there are some, in Britain, it is possible to win, for your party to win more votes and still not get a majority in Parliament. Is that right? Karen may know this better than the rest of us, actually.
Well, it's still based on district, so I guess that the same thing could happen.
But I mean, it was a fairly, as far as I know, our electoral system was fairly unique, and you know, it came sort of at the end of the convention, as I explained earlier. After the big thing was, there was this great concern that if Congress, you know, if you had a permanent body, then particularly an existing president would just dole out the pork to get reelected. And if you were going to have presidents, so in the early convention, it was more typical to propose that there be a single term for the president. Once they decided they wanted to have 2 terms, then it's like, well, we got to do a temporary body so that, you know, they only meet once, they meet in their states, and they pass it on the Congress. It's going to be very hard to corrupt them.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to note that the framers, frankly, didn't have a lot of confidence in the ability of the average person to make this decision. That's why, I mean, there are good logistical reasons too that John mentioned, just about communication and traveling back in those days. But same reason they didn't allow direct election of the U.S. Senate. They didn't think the people were quite up to making this decision. And, you know, that's an uncomfortable element of all of this. Are we, by not changing the Electoral College, saying, well, we still think that's true, even though we don't get the wise people who come together and deliberate the way that the framers hoped that we would in each state.
Well, that's a good segue into this next question that's been posed by our audience. So much has changed since the Constitution was written. How much weight should we put into how the founders intended the country to be run? Wouldn't it be reasonable to think that parts of the Constitution, like the Electoral College, might need to be revised after all these years?
It's perfectly reasonable to review different aspects of the Constitution. And I will say that there is no other part of the Constitution that has been proposed to be amended than the Electoral College. There's been something in the neighborhood of 1,000 efforts in the Congress to change, to amend in some way the Electoral College system, far more than any other part of the Constitution, which is an indication that we have periodically reviewed the system and thought about changing it. But there may be a reason why at the end of the day, we don't end up changing it, except as we did by the 12th and 23rd Amendments, which were relatively minor changes. And that is that it has worked extraordinarily well all these years. It is in some respects the envy of the rest of the world, because we have a system that not only works, but that leads to a peaceful transition of power and has done so for almost 250 years. That's a remarkable thing in and of itself.
I would just say, and I don't disagree with any of that, Michael, except we've had 45 presidents, 5 of whom did not win the popular vote. Is that a problem? You're right. I mean, the system worked as it was supposed to. It's not about, does the system work? It's about, do we still have the right system in place? At least to me.
Well, I suppose there's different ways to look at those 5 elections. In a few of them, I'm not sure we even know who actually got more votes than the other candidate, because it was so razor thin and so close. That's not true of the 1824 election, where Andrew Jackson got more than 10% more votes than did John Quincy Adams. But I think the way the framers set up the system is to think of it in this sort of way. If the people can't really make up their mind, if they don't pick a decisive winner, then we're going to let Congress have the choice. And keep this in mind. It's a sort of little known secret about the Electoral College system that wouldn't really change if we went to a popular vote system. The winning candidate is chosen by about 20% of the American people. So I think some people think that if we went to a plurality popular vote system, it would mean that a majority or something close to a majority of the American people were choosing the president. That is not the case, because we have so many people who don't vote, who don't even register to vote, that what we get in this system and what we would get in any other system is roughly 20%. Sometimes it's less than that. Sometimes it's as little as 18% of the American people choosing the president of the United States. And if what you're interested in is democracy, I'm not sure that's democratic, if you want something to be democratic, as in something close to a majority.
Well, speaking of who gets to participate in this process, we have a question about Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and other territories. Is it the case that these territories have no input whatsoever into a presidential victory? Do U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico even vote for president?
Well, they have no electoral vote, so I don't know why they would, I don't think they vote in the general election. Now, the parties would decide whether or not they vote in the primaries, and I think they do vote in the primaries. But in the general election, they have no electoral vote, so would be no reason to have a general election in those territories.
And one thing that you may find is there does seem to be some impetus among Democrats for admitting Puerto Rico as a state, because they would probably, as they have with the District of Columbia, they would probably typically get those votes. So one thing that you could see, if the Democrats have a majority in both the House and the Senate, and a Democratic president, you might see a push for statehood. Add a few more electoral votes that would be fairly reliably, would fairly reliably go Democratic.
This next question is about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This would be another way, I think, of possibly changing our process, but it would be accomplished at the state level. And the audience member notes that several states have agreed to this, and it would award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. If that was adopted widely enough, it would effectively eliminate the Electoral College without actually abolishing it. Do you think that is a good idea? And do you think courts would allow it to stand if it went into effect? That's a great question.
Well, I can tell you this much, you'd have some very angry voters in states who believed that they worked hard on campaigns and worked to elect one candidate. And what would end up happening really is voters in other states would determine where the votes in that particular state went. So it's a very hard argument to make, because what you're really saying to an individual state is, we won't decide where our electoral votes go. We will let people in other states decide where our electoral votes go. And I just can't imagine that argument winning the day.
Well, I guess I thought the sort of the genesis behind this was the idea that whoever won the state, I guess I don't understand what they're saying, Michael, that.
I think Dr. Federici has it right. The
proposal
is, if you're in California, you agree, California says we're going to cast our vote for the national popular vote winner no matter what. So it's sort of like Ulysses tying himself up, so that he can't do what he wants at the moment. He does what he thinks is for the longer good. But I do think it would be subject to major court challenges. And my hope for this election is that it is not ultimately decided in the courts. I just hope they can stay out of it. And, I'd prefer a strong winner on one side or the other, rather than another trying to repeat 2000 all over again.
I think 16 or so states, I might have the number a little bit off, have passed laws to join this effort. So now that's a long way from a majority, or certainly 50, but it does reflect some level of dissatisfaction with the current system.
True. Now here's another, all of these questions are great. How does one become a member of the Electoral College and cast votes for the president? What are the qualifications for a member of the Electoral College?
I could rather cynically say it depends on how much money you give to the candidate, but I suspect that it has more to do with being, a real partisan, being out there on the front line, and, someone that the party would logically come to, or you went to them, they'd say, yes, we know you're dependable. We'd, be glad to have you as an elector.
I have met 2 electors in my lifetime, both when I lived in Pennsylvania, and I think they're indicative of the kind of people who become members of the Electoral College. And one was a Democrat, and one was a Republican. The Democrat was the former mayor of the city of Erie, Joyce Savacchio, and she was as much of a yellow dog Democrat as you can find. That is, somebody who would sooner vote for a yellow dog than a Republican. So, that's a safe person to put in as an elector. And the other one I met was in 2000, when George W. Bush came to Erie to the airport, and there were 10,000 people there. And I was doing media analysis, and I came early, and I bumped into this woman who had, from head to toe, she had Bush bumper stickers. She had a Bush in her head. She was tattooed Bush. She was as loyal as you could possibly imagine. And she was an elector. You can't, that's the people that the parties are looking for when they choose electors. People who are diehards for the party and extremely loyal. They're not going to stray.
Right. This year in New York, Hillary Clinton is a Democratic elector. So it's hard to imagine she's going to violate, if New York goes Democratic, don't think she's going to cross over and cast her vote for Donald Trump.
So reliability seems to be the predominant factor there.
Yeah, party loyalty, yeah.
Do you think that it is an indictment of our political system that none of the countries who needed a new form of government after World War II thought to adopt a system similar to the US?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because the circumstances in which the United States were developed, which is to say states were always a big part of the country. Why? Because they were first colonies, and as colonies, they were independent from one another. So the development politically and the sovereignty as it developed in the country developed on a very decentralized level. And so from the time that we were debating whether or not to reconcile with England or to declare independence, representation was based on states, and the psychology and psychological attachment of the people was to states. That's rare. Federalism, which is part of all of that, is extremely rare. Most countries in the world have unitary systems, and in part because their circumstances are very different. They don't have subnational entities like states in the way that we have states. So I don't think it's in any way an indictment. I just think there's something unique about the United States and the role that states play in their political system. And I'll add this one last point. There's one thing left in the Constitution that is not subject to the normal amendment process, which is to say, Dr. Weil mentioned that it's 2/3 supermajorities in the House and the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states. There's one thing that requires every single state to agree for the Constitution to be amended, and that is equal representation in the Senate. That's the one thing that it is pretty much impossible to amend away, that the framers set aside. Why is that? Because Americans at the time thought that states were so vitally important to what they were politically. And the Electoral College, in part, emanates from that very attachment to the role that states play in the American political system. That's extremely rare internationally. You don't really find that kind of attachment to these subnational units much anyplace else in the world.
We've had a couple of questions that are about comparing our system to other systems. What about at the time the Electoral College was adopted? At that time, was it prevalent for the heads of state in other countries to be elected by popular vote?
No, it was not. We clearly did not want a monarchy. If you read Common Sense, which was sort of the catalyst to, just prior to our Declaration of Independence, we were particularly set against hereditary monarchy. Now, what has happened, of course, since then is that much of the power in Britain and in other constitutional monarchies have devolved to the parliament. So they're actually closer to our system in that respect than they were to the kind of monarchies from which we were departing.
But at this time, when this was written, it was unusual then for there to
I think it was as democratic probably as any process in the world at that time at that level. The closest you would have come would have been your town meetings, maybe in New England. But for a national entity, I think we came as close to, democracy as could be attained.
It's a Republican instrument.
Yes.
We use the language of democracy today, but the framers would have used the language of Republican. And the Republican form of government was extremely rare in the late 18th century.
Well, gentlemen, I think we have just about come to the end of our time. We were not able to get to all of the questions that were posed by the audience, and we're sorry for that, but we're glad that they did attend and were interested enough to post those questions. We certainly want to thank all of the sponsors for this event, the College of Liberal Arts, the University Honors College, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, the American Democracy Project of MTSU, and the League of Women Voters of Murfreesboro, Rutherford County. Remember that the video of this will be up on the College of Liberal Arts YouTube channel. I want to end by sharing with you a quote that I found as I tried to refresh my memory about the Electoral College in anticipation of this. This is from a professor at Gettysburg College who said There is hardly anything in the Constitution harder to explain or easier to misunderstand than the Electoral College. And I'm sure that everyone will agree with me that our panel has risen to that challenge and done an excellent job of explaining this piece of our electoral process. Now, if we were in an auditorium, I would ask the audience to join with me in thanking you by giving you a round of applause. As I heard somebody else say the other day, I can't hear it on Zoom, but I'm sure the audience is applauding you right now. We do thank all of you and thank all of you in the audience. Remember that Tuesday, November 3rd is Election Day, and it is still true that every vote counts. Thank you.